estar aqui junto ao professor Dr. Joerg Rieger, da Methodist University, Texas, que está visitando a Universidade Metodista para uma semana de estudos e para palestras no programa de pós-graduação em Ciências da Religião. Como visiting professor, nós temos o prazer de entrevistar ele para saber um pouco do seu trabalho, da sua proposta aqui, e para que nós possamos entender melhor esse tipo de intercâmbio entre os Estados Unidos e a nossa universidade. Professor Rieger, qual é a área de atuação do senhor na sua universidade? Dr. Rieger, what is your research field and area of study at your university?
My field is called systematic theology or constructive theology, and I'm working on issues having to do with theology and power. And when we're talking about power, we're looking at all kinds of other issues like economics, social class, social movements. One of my interests is in religion and labor. And we're also asking what difference power means. So one of the questions of power is to ask, how does power shape theology? How does dominant power shape Christianity? And sometimes this means that the dominant powers of our age take over. When you go back to Jesus, it's the Roman Empire that takes over Christianity. Today it's other forces of empire. But the reason why we're dealing with this is not just to criticize power, but also to find alternative movements of power. And so the question is, what difference does Christianity make? So it's not just an abstract study, but it's also helping us to find different ways of life, different ways of being Christians, different ways of living our faith. That means I'm working as an academic. I teach courses at the university, I'm writing books, but I'm also working with grassroots movements, social movements on the ground.
Não é a primeira vez que o senhor está na América Latina. Qual é a sua relação com este continente? It's not the first time you are in Latin America. What is your relation with the continent, Central and South America?
I don't talk about this much, but I've had this fascination with Latin America ever since I was a child in Germany. It was a mysterious continent, and I had a teacher in school telling me to learn Latin in school because this would help me to learn Spanish, so I learned that. But the more practical reason is that I now live and teach theology in Dallas, Texas, in the United States, and this is a place where we have a lot of Spanish-speaking people living in that city. So there's a Latin American population living right in our neighborhoods in the United States, and there may be 30 to 40% of them in Dallas. The other part of that story is that I started to study liberation theology about 25 years ago. And one of the original forms of liberation theology comes from Latin America. So about 20 years ago, I spent a few weeks in Peru with Gustavo Gutierrez when I wrote my dissertation. This was my first time in Latin America at the time, and I had learned some Spanish, and so I was very excited to learn about a different culture and to use some of my Spanish. And when I went back to the United States after a couple of weeks, I felt more homesick for Latin America than I felt homesick for Germany, where I had grown up. And the reason for that was not just romantic, but because among the people struggling for a better life and struggling with liberation theology, I found some real hope, and I found the Holy Spirit at work. And then I was invited to Brazil and to some other countries, and I kept coming back and I kept learning. But I should also say something else about this relationship, because there were people at times that would study Latin American liberation theology and that would import it into the United States almost like an imported product. And this is not what I'm doing. We have developed for many years our own liberation theology in the United States that addresses our own issues. And so it's not a matter of just exporting and importing, but it's a matter of being. So the reason why I'm coming back is because I'm still learning, but I also believe that Latin America can learn something from us. It's a mutual process. I often talk about a place like Dallas as living in the valley of the beast, and by that I mean the post-modern empire, neoliberal capitalism, And so by living in a situation like that, we're learning a lot about the problems of our time, but we're also developing modes of persistence from which we can learn. The other part of that relationship is that in a place like Dallas, Texas, we understand the contemporary empire pretty well because I call it the belly of the beast. We are experiencing the pressures of neoliberal capitalism. We're in a place where there's a lot of power and money concentrated. And in this context, we're learning a lot, not only about the problems, but also developing solutions. So the question is, what can we learn from each other? What can we tell you? What can you tell us? And in the process, I have worked together with several Latin American theologians, yourself included, but also Junmo Sung from this university, Nestor Miguez from Argentina, and others. We have published books together as well. So it has been a very productive relationship, and I'm looking forward to developing it for many years to come.
Como você está vendo a sua proposta específica que você está trazendo para a América Latina para conservar, para conversar e dialogar? You have told, shared with us your special research field. What do you think, what is specific, what you in the moment can contribute for our discussion?
The first thing I think is we have to understand that religion is always part of the other developments as well. So if we're looking at the global developments, if we're looking at economics, at politics, at culture, religion is always a part. The problem is that religion is not always helpful when it comes to these developments. Sometimes religion simply backs up the status quo. And this happens even when religion is not aware of it. So religion sometimes thinks it is happening in isolation, but even when religion is in isolation, it very often supports the status quo. So my question then is, what is the alternative? And in finding alternatives to this world of power, I'm talking about many of the traditions of Christianity which show us alternatives. If you look at the ministry of Jesus, for instance, he did not support the status quo, but he had a different way of life. And this is what people found exciting, and this is what other people found dangerous. And there are many other figures in church history. We talk about Jesus, we talk about Paul. As a Methodist, I'm also talking about John Wesley in that way. John Wesley understood that there was a difference between religion that goes from the top down and religion that goes from the bottom up. Religion that goes from the top down is the sort of religion that picks up the ideas of the powerful, that tries to be effective, that tries to do what corporations do, that tries to do what big leaders do, what business people do, and that's one way to do religion. And this is part of the world in which we live. This is just normal. What interests me, though, is what is the alternative? What does religion that moves from the bottom up look like? This is something that was developed in Latin American liberation theology, for instance, when they talked about doing theology in the community of the base churches. And what happened was they were building new relationships, they found communities that helped each other out, and that also developed new theological ideas. What they realized is that you can think about God in normal terms, God as a worker, God as a person on the street, God as a woman perhaps, God as somebody who does everyday labor. What I find exciting is that this brings us back to our Christian and our Jewish traditions in new ways, because in the Bible, God is often talked about in that way. In the beginning of the Bible, for instance, God is portrayed as a worker who plants a garden and who forms Adam out of clay. So God doesn't tell somebody else to plant a garden and make Adam, but God does it with God's own hands. And then when you talk about Jesus Christ, he basically was a day laborer in construction. This is the ministry that he did, and these are the people that he befriended and that he helped understand and realize the kingdom. So those are just a few examples, but it gives you an idea of the difference that theology can make in helping us to imagine alternatives and to live a different life.
Muito obrigado, professor Rieger. É prazer de falar com o senhor.